r/Askreddit. Flight attendants. Have you ever had to deal with a person dying mid-flight? How did you go about it? Flight attendant here. Once on a flight over the Pacific Ocean I had a death in flight. An older gentleman and his wife, I guessed in their 70s, were the last aboard the aircraft. They had to be wheeled to their seats on board by the wheelchair porters. In hindsight, we probably should have known something was fishy when the gentleman had to be shaken awake by the porters once he got to his seat, but at the time he just appeared to be drowsy and napping. But anyway, we took off and went about the flight as usual. About halfway into the flight, one of the other flight attendants came up and told me that he thinks he heard a passenger collapse in the lavatory and that he needed help getting the door open and that whoever was inside was not responding to them. So we go to the back and pop the lav door off its hinges, and lo and behold, guess who falls out? It's the older gentleman, and he's unresponsive. We rolled him onto his back and he was barely breathing, so I told the other flight attendant to stay with the passenger and page for any medical professionals on board while I went to grab emergency medical equipment. But the whole time we were trying to coordinate that his wife is yelling at us that he's fine and to just return him to his seat. He was not fine. By the time I grabbed our emergency Eden medical kits and O2 tanks and made it back to the passenger, there were 3 nurses who had already started CPR on the fella, and as a messy surprise, once they unbuttoned his shirt they found that he had one of those, I think they're called colostomy bags, the poop bags that attach to your guts, and so they were trying to do CPR around that. Sadly, the gentleman ended up expiring, and after receiving clearance from a doctor on the ground over our satellite phone, the nurses stopped CPR after about an hour. What was left was the corpse of a relatively tall Caucasian male in our gallery whose feet blocked off one of the aisles and who was also covered in oozy shit due to his poop bag breaking during CPR. We tried our best to cover him with blankets and kept other people out of the area. His wife was of course terribly upset, and she went from uncontrollable wailing to silence, and at one point I heard her giggling a little under her breath, probably shock, poor thing. I got some medical details about the gentleman from her, and we found out that he had a stroke about 2 weeks prior and also had lung cancer and got out of hospice care to try to make one final vacation together, and that the morning of the flight they made the decision to double both his painkillers and anti-anxiety meds in preparation to fly. Because we were over the ocean, we had to continue on to our arrival destination with the body in the galley for about another hour and a half of flight. When we arrived at the airport, the sheriff's department also wouldn't allow anyone to leave the plane for at least 45 minutes after arriving at the gate because they had to clear the scene of any foul play. It was a somber planing following that, to say the least, but surprisingly all of the passengers were extremely understanding, and we didn't even receive any complaints about what happened, or if we did they were never relayed back to that particular crew that day. Upvote for good story and because you're a real flight attendant. Somewhat relatable. I was on a flight from NY to London. We were about 2 or 3 hours in when the captain came on and said that due to a medical emergency, we'd be landing at St. John's, Newfoundland. We got there close to midnight. The airport was empty, and there was snow everywhere. As for the medical emergency, it was an older lady. I think she must have had a stroke. The flight attendants asked if there was a doctor on board. There wasn't, but there was someone studying to be one. A young guy. He was with her the entire time. We waited on the tarmac for the ambulance to arrive, which took quite a while. They carted her off. At that point she was still alive. I don't know anything beyond that. Once she was off, the attendants brought the medical student to first class. Then we waited as the captain got together a flight plan to continue to London. It took several hours. In total, we were on that tarmac for 4 hours. Well, I'm a better med student, and the absolute worst thing we can do is decrease altitude right now, mom. So hang in there, cowgirl. You wouldn't believe the amount of planes we get in Newfoundland that have to land in St. John's Gander for that exact reason. Not a flight attendant, but my dad has been flying for the same major airline for more than 35 years. And last year my sister and I were on a flight that he was captaining, and my sister is an RN. About 3 hours into the 10-hour overnight flight, flight attendants alerted my dad that a guy was having a medical issue, and so he goes, "Oh, wake my daughter up. She's a nurse." They also announced over the speaker to ask if there was a doctor. There wasn't. My sister is not a morning person, and so they wake her up and she wipes the drool off her face and goes to see the guy. She talks to him and figures out pretty quickly that he is having some kind of esophageal syncope thing. She asks him if he took anything, especially because she can see that he's been served alcohol at some point in the flight. He says yes but won't tell her what it is. She's like, "Sir, I do not give a single fuck, I am not a cop, I'm just trying to help you," but he refused. I don't know what she had him do, but it eventually passed and he felt better, so she went back to her seat. I slept through the whole thing because I am super helpful. Seriously people, never hold back what drugs you've taken when asked by a medical professional. Doctors and nurses are not the police, generally don't give a shit what you took, they just want to save you. Providing that information to them can be the difference between life and death. I personally had to admit to the doctor in an ER that I had taken alcohol, caffeine, marijuana, and MDMA one night when I got too fucked up and had to get rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. Might have saved my life that night in hindsight. I'm an airline pilot. Unfortunately this is not uncommon, because the cabin environment, reduced oxygen, partial pressure, travel stress, fear of flying stress, can be potentially harsh to people already chronically or acutely unwell. Early morning, elderly person with a history of cardiac problems, hasn't eaten or drank, stressed from the rush of traveling through an airport, stressed from a fear of flying. Unfortunately it has been known to trigger things like strokes or angina and even cardiac arrests. It hasn't happened to me. Luckily my serious medicals have all ended in good news with the passenger recovering in hospital, but I have colleagues who have had a passenger die. I'm not sure the majority of people actually realize the training the cabin crew actually go through. They are not on board to solely placate and fetch you a gin and tonic. Their main role is above all else, safety, to expeditiously get you off in the event of an evacuation and to be capable of providing advanced first aid. They, and us in the flight deck, are medically trained and have to go through a government-approved program of refresher training annually biannually. The cabin crew have access to a defibrillator, oxygen, drugs and a large quantity of first aid equipment and materials across 3 first aid kits. Long-haul aircraft have a secure pack of serious emergency use drugs like adrenaline and anesthetics that the crew cannot use. They are only for the use of any doctors on board during a medical emergency. The crew are all trained to recognize the symptoms of, coordinate, and immediately begin to treat serious emergencies like strokes, arrests, anaphylaxis, all sorts. At least 3 will treat in predefined roles while the 4th will call us to pass details and provide a preliminary recommendation. That is, we have to divert now. Unfortunately passengers can and do die. The success rate of ROSE, recovery from arrest, outside of hospital is very poor. When they do, the crew do all they can to protect the dignity of the passenger and assist comfort their relatives or travel companions on board. The passenger remains in their seat with an oxygen mask on to give the rest of the passengers the impression they are still alive, as a death would make people uncomfortable and have them staring at the unfortunately deceased passenger, undermining their dignity. The whole process is rigorously trained and designed to provide the best medical care possible from non-doctors, nurses, and to provide as much personal care and dignity as possible in the circumstances. Someone else posted in this thread they have a relative working as cabin crew claiming the passenger is moved to the flight deck. Utter bullshit. Thanks for this. As a paramedic I did wonder what drugs etc. you had on board. Last time I boarded a flight there was information that a patient had a severe allergy to oranges. I mentally refreshed myself on the anaphylaxis pathway just in case. Then the dessert had oranges in it and it turned out they weren't actually severely allergic. Phew. I flew UK to USA. Well, a lady who was walking past me fainted. She hit her head pretty hard on an armrest on her way down. I get out my seat and start putting her in the recovery position. I'm trained in ALS. She starts to come around and the crew arrive then. One stewardess is trying to get the woman to stand up and walk back to her seat. Like she was lifting under her armpits, and this lady was still confused and saying ouch my head, and is probably still waiting for all her vision to return. I stare right up, said that's terrible advice. She hit her head as well as lost consciousness, and forcing her to stand immediately is a great way for her to faint 2.0. I ask for ice for her head, no bleeding, good lump forming, encourage the lady to stay laid on the floor and to sit up once she felt okay. I told them people need to stay on the floor until they've had ample time to recover. I asked the lady how she felt before she passed out and she confirmed she sometimes feels funny when she stands too fast due to low BP, so that plus being in the air equals KO. I told her she should see a doctor and look out for signs of concussion. Have something to eat, stand up slowly, act. I don't know whether the training was crap or if it was just those 2 employees that were useless. Either way, I hate to imagine what they'd have done if I wasn't sat in the right place. Or if there had been a more severe emergency. I wouldn't raise my hand if they put a call out for medical staff. I'm not even a qualified nurse, but I feel like I'd be more useful than the staff if they aren't even aware of how to treat someone who lost consciousness and or hit their head. Madness. They gave me a bag of mini bottles of wine for my inconvenience. Damn. Very interesting. Thank you for the comment. Not a flight attendant, but I work in the field. Recently there was a guy who died mid-flight, was flying with his daughter who was 16 or so, can't quite remember the exact age. He had a stroke or some kind of a heart failure. The daughter had flown half a flight with him dead by her side thinking he was sleeping. They only noticed it when the plane landed. Can't even imagine the pain. And the thought that the last thing you'd do with your father would be boarding on a flight. Wasn't even a nice airline. But I believe they were flying from a holiday. At least a nice last memory, I guess. I can imagine an airline like Spirit or Ryanair sending her a bill for the died in flight fee. It's fairly common. You basically move the other passengers to the row to other seats if possible, or you cover them with a blanket if there is nowhere else to move them. Dead bodies are dangerous right after death, so the main priority to preserve as much dignity for the deceased as possible and to keep the other passengers calm. Well, that's terrifying. Why would people just die on a plane? I was on a cruise when there was an evening announcement that the ship would be going faster than usual overnight and would reach the port a few hours earlier due to a medical emergency. My parents, avid cruisers, said that's code words for need to drop off a dead guy. If it was a true medical emergency, the patient would be helicoptered off. But if a person just dies, the cruise line wants to discreetly as possible remove the body, hence, getting to a port very early before all the passengers are milling around. As to why make that announcement at all, and just get to port earlier without anyone knowing. It's a legal thing with the gambling. People gamble all night on cruises, but once you get to the destination, gambling must stop. So the announcement is really for the gamblers. Came here to tell my own cruise ship tidbits. I was an employee on the ship, not of the kind who would deal directly with this sort of situation, but I definitely heard about it. Old people love cruises and many of them literally get on ships and cruise until they die. Consequently, death was not too uncommon, particularly on my line, which catered to an older crowd. People would die in common areas around other guests, and the way the staff handled it was usually to bring out a wheelchair with an empty IV attached to it, load up the body, cover it in a blanket, and wheel it out. When people see an unconscious person being wheeled around with an IV, it's assumed they have some sort of illness or condition. Not that they're dead. The ship even had a small morgue, located on the crew deck strangely close to the mess hall. Maybe they shared refrigeration facilities. We would do transatlantic crossings with no ports for 4 or 5 days. Gotta have a place to keep the bodies from decomposing. Well, you calmly ask the passengers if anyone knows how to fly a plane. I picked the wrong day to quit sniffing glue. As a passenger, I had a guy next to me start dying. His lips were blue and he was going in and out. He had explained to me when he got on about his cumbersome oxygen travel tank that he uses because he smoked like a chimney and inhaled fumes in Vietnam, and he was also NYPD during 9/11. When I saw him going, I hooked up his oxygen for him. Then we pretended nothing happened because a man nod seemed to be intimate and emotional enough for that tough old bastard. I still think of him sometimes. He is basically a superhero that we all forgot. I was on a flight with my mom and dad, who are both doctors. There was a medical emergency as a passenger was having chest pain. My parents gave him all the first aid possible, but his health quickly deteriorated, and my parents basically took turns for an hour or two along with the air hostess trying to stabilize him and give him CPR. He didn't survive, unfortunately. Turns out was returning home after a renal surgery from another country and had significant heart issues, was only 48. Since my parents were the ones administering medical aid, had to disembark last and have a whole slew of paperwork and cross-examination, so that the airline can protect itself in case of any lawsuit. There were 2 other doctors on the flight who didn't move a muscle in case they get sued for some reason. I have never been prouder of my parents. They rushed in to help without hesitation and selfishness. It happened to my mother. A mom was taking her son who was dying of AIDS back home to Mexico City to die with his family. On the way he went to sleep and never woke up. The mom looked over at my mother midway through the flight and said he's not sleeping as he was very sad. They played it off like he was just sleeping so as not to alarm the other passengers. The captain radioed ahead to the ground crew who had the mortuary services ready to take the body. They waited till everyone had gotten off the plane before having the mortuary come and take the body away. They decided not to do an emergency landing because he was going home to Mexico anyway, and if they did an emergency landing the family would then have to arrange transport to Mexico City anyways. You can always appreciate people who apply good judgment to emotionally fraught circumstances. There was one time where my mom and brother were flying to Lebanon, and at one point in the flight an older man died. What they told me was they pretty much just left him where he was and put a sheet over him. Afterwards they just made an emergency stop in Canada so they could take the body off the plane. Happy Cake Day. Like most stories this is second-hand, but my dad was an airline pilot who as part of an exchange program flew Hajj, Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca, flights out of Indonesia. He said that it was very common for villages to pool their money and send their oldest member to represent them on the pilgrimage. Because of their age and the physical stress of the Hajj they would frequently dial the flight back home. Their faith would sustain them through the event itself. They had a doctor on board whose job was to deal with this. They were quietly put in body bags and kept strapped into their seats until the plane landed. To my dad's surprise this was viewed not as a tragedy but as an extremely good way to go. I'm not sure if this is mainstream Muslim belief, but he was told that by dying on the way back from completing the pilgrimage they were guaranteed a ticket to heaven. This will probably be lost among the rest of the comments, but I am pretty sure that I saved someone's life back in 2002 on a flight from London to JFK. The short version is that the guy next to me was having a stroke while we were over the Atlantic. A nurse on the flight gave him a quick once-over and suggested to the crew that he was drunk or that it was something else benign. However, I was pretty sure that the guy was in trouble, and I convinced the crew that it was a real emergency and that the pilot should seek the advice of an MD over the radio. The pilot did so, and the remote MD advised them to divert to Maine, Bangor, I believe, where a medical team took over and ultimately hospitalized the guy. Here's the longer version. On his flight I lucked out and got upgraded from coach to business, which was awesome because business class had these cool pods set up in pairs that were side by side but facing each other in opposite directions. There was a little divider between each pod in a pair, and if you sat up you could see your neighbor. The guy next to me was an older and kind British man. We said hello on boarding but didn't otherwise interact until about mid-flight. Out of the blue, my neighbor starts reaching over the divider between us, trying to get my attention. I sat up to see what was up, and he was clearly struggling for words. He stammered a bit, would make some funny faces and then blurt out single words as if it took a great effort, but the words weren't adding up to sentences. He seemed mostly okay, but it was like he forgot how to speak and was confused. I called over a flight attendant, gave my uninformed opinion, who then called out over the speaker to ask for anyone with medical experience. This is when they brought in the one nurse on the flight. By the time the nurse came to us, my neighbor had seemingly recovered. He could talk just fine and was really embarrassed by the situation. He said that he was likely tired, dehydrated, and anxious. The nurse took him at his word, and things resumed back to normal. About 10 minutes later, my neighbor reaches over and gently touches my leg, which was the easiest thing for him to reach, so I sat up and asked him if he was alright. He, again, was unable to clearly speak, so I summoned a crew member again. Things repeated almost exactly as before. My neighbor could speak again. He's apologetic and embarrassed, and everyone just kind of blows it off. Now keep in mind, at this point I am still the only person that has witnessed my neighbor during his odd phase, when he can't speak, and he's been reluctant to come out and admit or describe his symptoms in this way himself. Moreover, The nurse on the flight was not a native English speaker, so I am pretty sure that there was some information lost in their exchanges. I decided that I was going to intervene. The crew had been really professional, but I was certain that they were missing the big picture. I huddled with some of the crew in the galley and more or less said, I am not a MD, but I am certain that this man is having a stroke. I explained how all of his symptoms fit the pattern and that it was common for such symptoms to be sporadic. In the end, they agreed with me that having the captain radio an MDO was a smart next step, which they did. The remote MD also thought that my neighbor was in trouble, so they planned on diverting the flight. As it turned out, my neighbor's symptoms got worse and became more obvious, so the nurse that was on board came back and took my seat to keep a watch on him and to assist. I got bumped to first class to make space, and as a nod of thanks from the crew. The crew was extremely grateful for my help, so they literally pampered me to excess during the flight. They kept bringing me treats to eat and drink, which almost made me sick because I overdid it, and they also asked me to pick anything out of the flight catalog as a thank you gift. I picked the cheapest thing, a pen, but it was a really nice one. A couple of days later, I got a phone call from my flight neighbor who had gotten my contact information from the airlines. He confirmed that, yes, he did have a stroke, that he was hospitalized for a couple of days, was in good shape now, and that he was incredibly grateful. I never heard from anyone else involved with the event after that, but that's okay. The moral of the story is this: the symptoms of a stroke can be strange and sporadic. Look for someone seemingly losing the ability to speak, and don't dismiss symptoms just because they come and go. Not a doctor or witness to one of these events, but my parents were once on a plane where someone had a medical emergency and the EMTs were waiting at the gate to help the guy. The flight attendants made an announcement for everyone to stay in their seats so the EMTs could get to the patient, but nobody listened. My parents were horrified as they watched the aisles fill up with people, making it impossible to get to the patient. My parents never found out what ended up happening, but I can't imagine things ended well for the patient if they couldn't even get medical attention once the plane finally landed. After he expired, we stripped him of his clothes, donned him in a parachute, pulled the ripcord as we shoved him out of the plane. It was last reported that he landed on an ocean liner during a naked cruise and went face down between a woman's legs as she was tanning. She loved it, but he was dead to the world.